October 17, 1948, 11:47 p.m. New York Tribune. Ninth floor. Most stories don't change the person who writes them. This one did. The newsroom was nearly empty. The kind of quiet that only exists after deadlines have passed and everyone else has gone home. One desk light burned in the corner, casting a dull glow over scattered papers. A half-empty coffee cup gone cold hours ago, and a cigarette slowly turning to ash in its tray. Michael Sullivan sat alone. In front of him was a single file folder. Thick, overstuffed, the kind of folder reporters learn to respect. The kind that carries weight, not just paper weight, but consequence. Inside were arrest records, police reports, witness statements, financial estimates. Page after page building. A case against one man, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. The name was already infamous. King of Harlem. Numbers boss. Gangster. A man the police called untouchable, and the public whispered of like a legend. According to everything in that folder, this was a simple story. Criminal exposed, myth destroyed. Reputation finished. Sullivan had written stories like this before, dozens of them. You follow the facts. You tell the truth. You go home. But tonight at 11:47 p.m., staring at that folder in the silence of the newsroom, Sullivan couldn't type a single word. Because this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a choice. The assignment had come down 3 weeks earlier. Delivered the way most big stories are, casually, almost carelessly, to Bumpy Johnson. Sullivan's editor had said, "Everyone treats him like some kind of Robin Hood. I want the truth. I want the story that reminds people what he really is." The public version of Bumpy Johnson was complicated. In Harlem, his name carried a strange kind of respect. People spoke it quietly, sometimes with admiration. A man who kept order. A man who helped his own. A man who stood up to worse men. The media version was simpler, cleaner, easier to print. Gangster. Racketeer. Career. Criminal. That was the version Sullivan knew how to write. From the outside, the story looked familiar. Almost routine. A powerful criminal wrapped in mythology, protected by silence, overdue for exposure. Sullivan had dismantled legends like this before. You peel back the image, line up the charges, follow the money, and let the facts do the rest. At least, that's what he thought. When he accepted the assignment, Sullivan didn't hesitate. He didn't question the angle. He didn't doubt the outcome. In his mind, the story was already written. This should be easy. A gangster with a reputation. A community fooled by charisma. A myth waiting to be destroyed. All Sullivan had to do was prove it. Sullivan started where he always did. The file, Bumpy Johnson, age 43. His criminal record stretched back nearly 25 years. The arrests alone filled pages. Robbery, assault, weapons charges, conspiracy, names, dates, case numbers, everything carefully documented. There was prison time too, not county jail. Not short sentences. Sing Sing, federal penitentiaries, Alcatraz. Years spent locked away alongside the most dangerous men in the country. This wasn't a small-time operator who'd gotten lucky. This was a career criminal who had survived long enough to build something big. Then there were the connections. Court documents and police intelligence tied Johnson to some of the most powerful crime families in America. The Luciano family, the Genovese family. Names that meant structure, money, and violence. You didn't work with organizations like that by accident. And finally, the numbers. Police estimates put the Harlem numbers racket at hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, millions in today's money. Cash flowing daily, untaxed, unregulated, illegal from top to bottom. And Bumpy Johnson took a cut of every dollar that moved through it. Sullivan had covered organized crime for 8 years. He knew what these patterns meant. Arrests plus prison time plus criminal alliances plus money always led to the same conclusion: guilt. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't myth. It was paper, evidence, facts stacked neatly inside a manila folder. And open and shut. Story. At least, that's what it looked like on paper. And yet, the longer Sullivan stared at the file, the less confident he felt. Nothing in it was wrong. The dates lined up. The charges were real. The numbers made sense. On paper, Bumpy Johnson was exactly who the system said he was. So why did it feel incomplete? Sullivan had learned to trust that feeling. After years of covering crime, he knew that when a story refused to settle, when the facts didn't bring clarity but discomfort, something was missing. 2 versions of the same story began forming in his mind. In the first, the familiar one, Bumpy Johnson was a predator, a gangster, who exploited his own community. A criminal protected by fear and silence. The kind of man reporters exist to expose. But the second version wouldn't go away. In that version, the facts were still true, but they didn't tell the whole story. The numbers, the arrests, the prison time explained what Bumpy did, but not why people spoke his name differently. Not why his reputation didn't match the damage men like him usually left behind. Sullivan tried to push the thought aside. Doubt had no place in an investigation built on evidence. You follow the file. You ignore the noise. Still, the noise was there. 2 stories. Same man. And only one of them could be true. Before we get to what changed everything, you need to understand why Sullivan believed the story he was about to write. Because from his point of view, there was no mystery, no gray area, no moral puzzle. There were facts, there was evidence, and there was a man who, by every legal definition, was a criminal. Sullivan didn't walk into this assignment naive or biased. He walked inexperienced. He had spent years covering organized crime, watching how power worked in the shadows, learning how communities were broken from the inside. He knew what dangerous men looked like. He knew how myths were built around them. And he knew how those myths usually collapsed the moment you held them up against the record. So before Harlem complicated the story, before doubt entered the room, before anything challenged what he thought, he knew this is what Sullivan was working with. The case against Bumpy Johnson, the operation itself, was simple. That was part of what made it so powerful. Every day, people in Harlem bet on 3-digit numbers: a penny, a nickel, a dime. Small amounts that felt harmless. If your number hit based on stock market closings or horse race results, you won 600 to 1. It was easy to play, easy to believe in, and completely illegal. This was the numbers racket. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson controlled it. According to police estimates, the operation generated tens of thousands of dollars every single week. Cash moving hand to hand, house to house, block to block. By the end of the year, it added up to millions, untaxed, untraceable, and unstoppable. Police officers Sullivan interviewed didn't mince words. They called Johnson the most dangerous man in Harlem. Not because he was loud or reckless, but because he was disciplined, organized, protected. Federal prosecutors were just as blunt. Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. Witnesses never testified. Cases fell apart. Evidence disappeared. He was the kind of criminal the system knew existed but couldn't remove. Court records tied him directly to major organized crime families. These weren't casual associations. They were business relationships, structure, power. Everything pointed in the same direction. This wasn't a folk hero. This wasn't a misunderstood figure. This was a criminal who had built an empire on illegal gambling and intimidation. At least, that's what the evidence said. And for a long time, that was enough. But the deeper Sullivan went, the harder it became to ignore the contradictions. If Bumpy Johnson was as dangerous as police claimed, why was he arrested so rarely? Not just convicted, arrested. Men with far less power cycled through jail constantly. Johnson didn't, single quotes T. If he ruled through violence, where were the victims? Organized crime always leaves a trail. Broken families, hospital records, bodies. Yet the files showed remarkably few direct victims tied to him. And then there were the witnesses. In other cases, witnesses stayed silent out of fear. In Harlem, they stayed silent out of something else. Loyalty. Names appeared again and again in court records, only to vanish when testimony was required. Not because they were threatened, but because they refused to speak. That was unusual. That was wrong. Sullivan knew what mob-controlled neighborhoods looked like. He'd seen them. Streets emptied after dark. Businesses strangled by extortion. Residents afraid to make eye contact, afraid to talk, afraid to exist. Harlem didn't fit that picture. Instead of boarded windows and abandoned storefronts, he found thriving businesses. Music spilling into the streets. Clubs packed night after night. A neighborhood alive in ways crime usually suffocated, and everywhere the same names surfaced. Not whispered in fear, not spoken with hatred, but mentioned with a kind of respect that made no sense at all. The facts were still there. The crimes were still real, but the story they were supposed to tell wasn't lining up, and that was a problem. Sullivan told himself there was a simple explanation. Every criminal has victims. They don't always show up in police files. Sometimes they're buried under silence, intimidation, or indifference. Maybe Harlem was no different. Maybe he just hadn't looked hard enough. So he made a decision he didn't usually make. He would leave the office. Not to police headquarters. Not to court archives. Not to another interview with men who already believed they understood Harlem from a distance. He would go there himself. If Bumpy Johnson had built his power by exploiting people, the evidence would be on the streets, in the shops, in the homes, in the voices of the people who had paid the price. Sullivan wasn't looking for admiration or mythology anymore. He was looking for damage, for fear, for the victims that every gangster leaves behind. And once he found them, the story would finally make sense. That decision changed everything. Because the moment Sullivan stepped out of the newsroom, the story stopped being about what was written in a file and started becoming something much harder to ignore. October 14, 1948, 2:30 p.m. Sullivan took the subway from Brooklyn to Harlem, riding north as the city slowly changed around him. Familiar neighborhoods gave way to unfamiliar faces, different rhythms, different conversations. By the time the train pulled into 125th Street, he already felt it. He didn't belong here. Sullivan was white, Irish, a reporter from Brooklyn with a notebook in his coat pocket and questions written all over his face. In 1948, that mattered. People noticed. Eyes followed him as he stepped onto the platform and climbed the stairs to street level. Harlem opened up in front of him. This wasn't segregation by law. New York didn't need Jim Crow signs to keep people in their place. Banks refused loans, realtors steered families away. Employers closed doors quietly. Black residents lived in Harlem not because they chose isolation, but because the rest of the city had chosen it for them. Inside that confinement, they had built a world of their own. Sullivan walked slowly, letting the streets speak before he did. Jazz music spilled out of open doorways. Clubs were already alive in the afternoon. Barber shops were full. conversations loud and unguarded. Women moved down the sidewalks dressed with care and pride, as if appearance itself were a form of resistance. Children played in the streets, laughing, arguing, completely unafraid. This wasn't what Sullivan expected to find. He had come looking for fear, for damage, for the quiet signs of a neighborhood under criminal control. Instead, he found something else entirely. And standing in the middle of Harlem, watching life unfold around him, Sullivan realized the story had already begun to change, whether he was ready for it or not. Before he arrived, Sullivan had already pictured Harlem. In his mind, he expected decay. Desperation. The visual language of criminal control. He expected shuttered storefronts, men standing on corners with nothing to do, businesses barely surviving under the weight of extortion. He expected fear, the kind that hangs in the air, when people know who really owns the streets. That wasn't what he saw. Music followed him as he walked. Jazz drifting out of clubs in the middle of the afternoon, not hidden, not subdued, but alive. Storefronts were open and busy. Barbershops packed with customers who laughed loudly and argued freely. Restaurants doing steady business. Families moving through the streets with purpose. There was energy here, not the forced kind. The real kind. People took pride in where they lived, in how they dressed, in how they carried themselves. This didn't look like a community being drained. It looked like one holding itself together. And then there was the name, Bumpy Johnson. Sullivan heard it again and again, spoken casually in conversation, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a point of reference, a solution. Sometimes even with gratitude. That's Bumpy's territory. Bumpy won't allow that. Bumpy takes care of it. The tone mattered. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration for power. It was trust. Standing there, notebook untouched, Sullivan understood something he hadn't been prepared for. This wasn't the aftermath of exploitation. This was the presence of order. And that made no sense at all. Sullivan stopped walking. Up to that moment, he had been collecting impressions, telling himself it was too early to draw conclusions. One afternoon didn't erase years of reporting. A neighborhood could look healthy and still be controlled by something rotten underneath. But standing there in the middle of Harlem, surrounded by life instead of fear, that explanation stopped working. The story he came to write no longer fit what he was seeing. This wasn't just about illegal gambling. It wasn't just about a criminal empire. It wasn't even about Bumpy Johnson. It was about the space he occupied. About why a man with his record could exist here, not as a villain, but as a stabilizing force. About what kind of system creates a world where the law is absent, and something else has to take its place. Sullivan hadn't come to Harlem looking for understanding. He came looking for victims. Instead, he found a question he didn't know how to answer, and that's when everything changed.